Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. I was born on Franklin Roosevelt's birth date and grew up proudly as a Roosevelt Democrat. We had a birthday recently, and I thought how different the world would be if we had someone like him in the White House. I invited Adam Cohen, a former New York Times editorial board member, to talk about this because he has written a wonderful best-selling book, Nothing to Fear, FDR's Inner Circle and the 100 Days That Created Modern America, to be my guest today. Welcome.
Great to be here, Ronnie, and a belated happy birthday to you.
Thank you very much. They're getting too high up. But anyway, it is amazing, isn't it, the difference? One person went to build up the country, and the other person seems intent on just breaking it all up.
It is amazing, but of course, as an historian, I think about the differences and the similarities.
Yeah.
And I've been struck by both at the beginning of this administration.
What made you interested in Franklin Roosevelt?
Well, like you, I grew up in Manhattan, Upper West Side. He was a revered figure and someone who really understood the positive things that government can do. And when I thought about, what were some of the best things government ever did, you do think of the New Deal. And when you think of the New Deal, you think of the first 100 days, because really that's when, not only when it started, but when a lot of the most innovative, interesting things occurred. So all that made me think it'd be great to write a book about the first 100 days.
What's so interesting in the book is that you show that it wasn't all that well organized, right?
Totally true. It was not well planned. There was some planning, and during the 1932 election, FDR had the famous Brains Trust, and these were very intelligent, very forward-thinking academics who put together some plans. But other than that, it was kind of thrown together. And when he took that famous oath of office, March 4th, 1933, and said, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself," they did not have a plan in order. And it really was, someone compared him to the MC of a TV show. There were people coming into his office, bringing him ideas, and he chose the ideas that he thought would work the best. Very impromptu.
But that's a very good trait, to be able to listen to all different views and then to make your own judgment. I mean, he was an enlightened governor of a state, wasn't he?
He was indeed, of New York State. But you're right, some people say actually that this was FDR's greatest strength. He wasn't the most book-read person. He didn't understand economics better than anyone. He wasn't the greatest planner, but he was someone who had incredible judgment, both of what ideas would translate into good policy, but also what was achievable political. That really was his gift.
Yeah. I think of him, and when I read this book more, because I don't necessarily follow all the details in the policy, but I can tell what the effect is going to be and what the reception is going to be. It's an interesting kind of thing.
That's right, and that really was FDR, and we glorify him so much that sometimes people think, well, he must have been brilliant in every way. But in fact, when John Maynard Keynes met with FDR, he left the meeting thinking, God, that guy doesn't really understand economics. And that may be true, but this was the guy who saved the banking system, who put America back to work, who ended the Depression. He didn't really need to understand all those charts to get it right.
He just needed to know what to do.
Yes.
He believed in balancing the budget. So here he had these ideas about how he's going to take care of everybody. It cost money, and yet he wanted to balance the budget. So there was that whole dichotomy, right?
Yes, and another very forgotten thing about him, because again, we think of him in a very unidimensional way, that he was the great liberal New Dealer, and people forget that part, that you're right. He was also someone who believed in a balanced budget, in part because he said, I know how families work, how households work. You have to balance your own budget to make things work. So one of the interesting things that I learned a lot about in writing this book was that he had some amazing heroic liberals around him during the first 100 days. And I think of Francis Perkins, first of all, Harry Hopkins, Henry Wallace. These are legendary figures. But one of the people he was closest to, and in fact, the person he actually thought he'd like to see succeed him as president for a while, was a guy named Lewis Douglas, his budget director. FDR had chosen Douglas because Douglas was the big balanced budget guy in Congress. And FDR wanted that foot on the brake. He wanted these great liberals around him with their pie in the sky ideas. And he wanted someone like Lewis Douglas to say, we can't go too far.
But that didn't really last for the 100 days.
Well, it was a battle. And one of my favorite dynamics of the 100 days was Frances Perkins on one side, and again, just an amazing figure, a great New Yorker. She was fighting to get public works programs. She really believed, as labor secretary, we need to put people back to work. Lewis Douglas didn't believe we had the money for it. And the cat and mouse dance that they played, the battle that they had, to the point where in Frances Perkins' wonderful oral history, which is at the Columbia University Oral History Archives and goes on at great length, she talks about how she finally figured out the thing to do was that to find out from the secretary when Lewis Douglas was meeting with FDR, get a meeting later in the day and be the last one to talk to FDR and talk him out of all that balanced budget stuff.
Did people really think that the last person who talked to him was the most influential?
It had an impact, it really did, because he was someone who everyone agreed he wasn't big on learning things from books. He wasn't someone who sat down with a big briefing book. He was someone who talked to the people around him. So yes, it was good to be the last person.
I was thinking of some of the similarities with Trump because it is, they say now, also the last person, but I'm not sure that's true. I think part of it is Mr. Trump, President Trump himself. But Trump uses the what do you call it? Texting.
Twitter, yeah.
And Roosevelt used the fireside chats.
Exactly right. There are many parallels between the two, and I think, we think of them as being so different ideologically that we may miss some of the similarities. But first of all, even their campaigns for office were very similar. These were two people who ran against the status quo. Hillary was running very much as a continuation of Obama. Trump was saying, we need to go in a radically different direction. That's very similar to FDR saying, Hoover is taking the country in the wrong direction. We need to change things sharply. They each actually, in their way, championed the common man. FDR talked about the forgotten man, and that was a very important part of his campaign. Well, for Trump, the same thing. He said that there were people in America, people in the heartland, people in the Midwest who were being forgotten, the regular working guy, the guy at the factory. And then also interesting is the focus on jobs. We think of Trump as being very conservative, and he's certainly showing that at the beginning of his administration, but you have to say that he's always appreciated the importance of a job for someone. And when he talks about bringing jobs back, when he talks about tearing up trade treaties in order to allow the manufacturing sector to grow again, that's talking about a man and a woman's relationship to their job in a very similar way to how FDR did. They both understood that employment, working, a job is very important to people's sense of self-worth.
But they really differ also greatly.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I mean, you call the New Deal the third revolution.
Yeah.
First revolution was?
It was the American Revolution. The second was the Civil War. And then, yes, the third was the New Deal. And we may be in the middle of the fourth now, because one thing that...
no, let's not say that.
Let's not say that. But one thing that the right has long wanted to do in America is to repeal the New Deal. And when you asked why I came to write this book, I also wrote it at a time when the Bush administration was talking very explicitly about rolling back the New Deal. There were plans to get rid of Social Security, to end a lot of the social safety programs, and that was expressly to try to undo what FDR did. That is the goal right now, and I'm not saying it's going to succeed, but when you look at what they want to do, when Paul Ryan talks about turning Medicaid into block grants, when they talk about undoing Medicare, undoing Social Security, they want to roll back all the things that started on March 4th, 1933.
But basic to it all is their concept of government, right? That keep government out of our lives.
Yes, make it so small that you can drown it in a bathtub. And the thing is, it's a testament to how much FDR achieved that it's amazing to go back and look at what the government looked like on March 3rd, 1933. There wasn't much to the federal government.
That was the day before?
Yeah, the day before FDR was sworn in. The federal government was mainly the Department of Defense, which defended our borders. It was the post office, which delivered the mail, and it wasn't much else. One of my favorite stories from working on the book was reading Frances Perkins' description of when she had to report for work as Secretary of Labor. So she has this job, Secretary of Labor, but no one really tells her what to do after she's sworn in. And she looks up the address of the Department of Labor in the phone book in Washington, D.C. She shows up, and it turns out to just be this ratty old office, and there are a lot of old union guys sitting around with spittoons and spitting on the floor, and she needs to actually pack up the current Secretary of Labor, who does not want to leave and said he thought that she wouldn't be coming for a while, get them out of there. But then she realizes there's not much there. We think now the Department of Labor is currently in an enormous building, which is called the Frances Perkins Building, and that is a major, major department. When these guys showed up, there just wasn't much to the federal government. This was stuff that FDR, Perkins, Hopkins, Wallace, and these people, they built it.
And what they did was momentous.
Extraordinary. And each little part of it, Henry Wallace, a farmer and a great thinker from Iowa, he comes in as agriculture secretary. The Farm Belt was distraught. People were not even planting anymore because they couldn't sell their crops. So everyone in the Farm Belt was broke. They were unemployed. A lot of them were starving. Revolutions were forming in the Farm Belt.
They were losing their farms.
They were losing their farms. They were being sold, absolutely auctioned off. And farmers were actually joining, left-wing movements. Henry Wallace comes in and he creates the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which begins farm subsidies and really brings the entire Farm Belt back to life. Similarly, Francis Perkins is doing that with labor. Harry Hopkins is doing that with relief. So amazing things are happening very quickly.
It was a whole different attitude about people who needed support,
Yeah.
the relief. They defined it in a different way,
Yes, they did.
which the Republicans still define it their way.
Yes, that's right. And one thing that also animated the New Dealers was the nation was in such a calamitous shape, right? So unemployment was at 25%. The stock market had fallen as much as 85%. And you walked around a city like New York and you would see families sitting on the sidewalk surrounded by their furniture. They'd been thrown out. They couldn't pay their rent. They had nowhere to go. The level of desperation was so high that it absolutely cleared the way for someone like Harry Hopkins to come along and say, we need a relief program. We need a program that just gets money quickly into the hands of unemployed people so that they can buy food. And there really was no alternative. People were starving. So it was really a moment that allowed all these things to start.
And Francis Perkins said, I guess Roosevelt believed it wholeheartedly, they need to have some work to do.
Absolutely. And
he started with a conservation corps, right?
Yes, yeah. Well, FDR,
Trees.
yes, FDR loved nature. He grew up on a big farm in Hyde Park, and he loved trees. And his idea, when everyone was talking about putting people to work, was, well, why not put them out in nature? So yes, his beloved program, the one he really designed and championed, was the Civilian Conservation Corps, which took people, many of them from cities who had really not seen many trees and had never been out in nature, a lot of them immigrant children, and sent them way out into nature. And I just, with some college roommates this summer, I did a hike along the Appalachian Trail, and we actually, one of the places we walked by was an old Civilian Conservation Corps site, deep in the Smoky Mountains, and you looked around, you could not see the sun, you couldn't see anything, you were deep in the forest, and I was thinking about these kids from the Bronx who FDR said it would do them good to see something like that, and they made a camp like that in North Carolina.
Yeah, it was quite amazing.
Amazing.
So we then, with Wall Street and the finance, my mother always talked about when the banks closed. I mean, she actually was talking about what she had on the day she heard that the banks were closed. And she was having lunch at the Lucerne Hotel that used to be on 79th Street. Wow. I mean, the whole, how you personalize everything.
Yeah.
But that was, Hoover had declared, they were closing banks, but states were doing that, right?
Yeah, but it was definitely a panic. There were photographs in the paper of thousands of people, many of them poor immigrants, lined up at the bank to try to get their money out, but the money was gone. And it was panic inducing because people immediately lost their life savings. They didn't have access to any money. And it was a state of absolute crisis. This carried over to the inauguration where people who went down for the inauguration, FDR declared a bank holiday, and they couldn't actually cash a check to pay their hotel fees. So yes, it was a state of desperation, and that's why when FDR hit the ground running starting on March 4th, the first thing they focused on was the banks. And the first big act of the New Deal was the Banking Act, because they had to prop up the banking system. FDR knew if we didn't have banks, if people couldn't take out money and pay their landlord and pay their grocer, the whole nation would never get up and running again. So that was the first great achievement.
And I think they passed it almost within the first 30 days. It was,
first 8 days. And it was done so quickly that they say a lot of members of Congress didn't even get to read the bill. They just voted for it because they trusted in FDR.
But they worked with him.
They did.
That was a big difference.
Yes.
That when he did have the bills, they brought together groups and they worked with members of Congress in the agencies. in the White House.
They did, and actually one sort of nostalgic thing to look back on is there was actually cooperation between the two parties. So when FDR won the election, in those days you weren't inaugurated in January, you inaugurated in March. That was a long interregnum, as they called it, a particularly long time when the nation was, despondent and when there was so much poverty, unemployment, desperation. So they had this long period, and if Hoover and Roosevelt's staffs had not been able to work together, that would have been an enormous delay. But the good news was they did work together. So FDR sent his people to Hoover's Treasury Department. They worked together and crafted the Banking Act that was passed in the first 8 days. That's a level of inter-party cooperation that sadly we don't see anymore.
It's just disappeared,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
So Roosevelt said the only fear we have is fear itself. But Donald Trump is making us fearful.
It's funny you say that. In fact, this morning I was reading my Twitter feed, as I do all the time, and someone tweeted that very thing. They said, remember FDR said we have nothing to fear but fear itself, and Trump is all about fear. And I thought that's a great point, because it's true. FDR was trying to make everyone feel that although, as they looked around, everything was very scary, that they would survive. That was important because it gave people the faith to move forward. And absolutely, I think you can say that this administration is trying to strike fear into people's minds when there isn't that much to fear. There was a lot to fear in 1933 when a quarter of the country was unemployed and people couldn't buy food. There isn't really a lot to fear right now. The Obama years were actually pretty good. The economy is doing well. There isn't that much to worry about. Yet, yes, the things we're hearing out of the White House are begin to panic.
Right. So tell me what you think about this White House.
Well, I mean, it's shocking, right? I mean, I think we're shocked by how quickly things have changed in the country, right? And quickly coming out of Washington, also quickly in response. I mean, the women's marches were amazing, right? And then after this executive order on refugees, the way the airports around the country filled up. So we're seeing both sides mobilize, but what a dramatic difference. And again, I would say in some ways that's a parallel to the FDR years where the difference between Hoover and FDR was so sharp. And the minute FDR took office, you knew that this was a Democratic administration that was bringing a new deal, and you saw all the bills being passed, and you saw the banks opening, you saw the excitement. We're seeing it a little bit in a reverse negative image here, because do we know that Trump is president? Yes, we do, because you go to the airports and there are huge protests, and there are refugees who are not being allowed in the country, and there are people marching because they're worried about what's going to happen to abortion rights, and we're going to get Trump's nominee for the Supreme Court. So there's a drama to these times that in some ways parallels the drama of 1933, but in the opposite direction.
But it doesn't have the base that FDR had, does it? I mean, the people who elected Trump, I don't know, has it been broken down so that it's people who didn't like Hillary and voted for him, plus those hardcore Trump supporters? But it's not mobilized the way Roosevelt's.
I think that's right. And for one thing, we're also much more divided, right? Because when FDR was elected, he was elected overwhelmingly. It was a landslide. And people loved the guy, right? I mean, there were a few pockets of resistance, but even the Republicans in Congress voted for those early New Deal bills because everyone back home was saying, we need to follow our president. So that was one model. The model we have now is, yes, a majority of people did not vote for the current president. According to the polls we've seen, and we know that polls have been unreliable, but the early polls show that his popularity has dropped significantly since he took office. So yeah, we're not seeing the same level of base, but he does have a base. And I think sometimes Democrats are too quick to say, we're the majority, 3 million more people voted for Hillary, we're
we're optimistic. We hope people agree with us.
But when you actually look at the elections, the Republicans not only have the White House, they have the Senate by a good majority, they have the House by a good majority, they have most of the governorships. I think the Democrats are down to only 18 governorships. So I think it's a mistake for Democrats to say, oh, no one likes him, no one likes the Republicans, because when you actually look at who is being elected into office, they're doing very well. So there's a real tension in this country.
Right, but they were very smart politically. the Republicans.
They have been,
With the
but
reapportionment and the whole, right?
all true, but then you look at this year's elections, and the Democrats could not win a governorship in Vermont. Vermont is the most liberal state. The Republicans are not losing the governorship of Mississippi, right? So if Republicans are capturing the state house in Vermont, which they just did, I do think Democrats need to work on.
How do you account for that when the neighboring New Hampshire defeated the incumbent senator? Was a Republican. Isn't that interesting?
It is interesting, and to some extent, I think it may be the difference between it being a state election and a federal election, and people do vote differently when they're not sending someone to watch, and there are personalities involved. But I think the bigger picture here is if Democrats' issues do so well in the polls, and they do, people are pro-choice, and they are a lot of things the Democrats stand for. They want a higher minimum wage, and if 3 million more people voted for Hillary than for Trump, when are the Democrats actually going to begin to take the levers of power back?
Yeah, that's the essential thing, right?
Yeah.
I loved in the book how you told the stories of the different principles, in the brain trust and also just around the president. I mean, the part of Frances Perkins with her husband, and it was just fascinating. Right? They were interesting people also.
Amazing people, but also one reason I told the story the way I did is I'm a big believer that a lot of the action in any organization, certainly in government, isn't just the person at the top. It is those people a little bit below the top person who really have firm ideas, who want to get them enacted, and who are persuasive, and who are articulate, and are good planners. And that was the case with the New Deal. As we discussed, FDR was a great MC, but it was people like Frances Perkins who came in and said, here's the bill we need to bring labor back. It was Harry Hopkins who said, here's how we get relief accomplished. It was Henry Wallace. These people were enormously influential, and they were amazing people. When in the book, I tell their life stories, and someone like Frances Perkins, who was born in a middle-class family in Worcester. Her father did not want her to even work. The most she could talk him into was letting her become a school teacher. She became a school teacher in Chicago, and then she sneaks into the city and begins working with Jane Addams at Hull House. And then she gets a graduate degree, and she ends up becoming the world's expert on factory safety after the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. These are amazing people who led amazing lives and did amazing things. And it's sad to me that Frances Perkins, isn't on the $10 bill, and that she's not, known to everyone in the country, because she wasn't just the first woman cabinet member. She was in many ways the mother of the New Deal. She's one of the main reasons we have the Social Security Act. These people deserve more attention.
Yeah, and she wasn't just an old maid, Miss Perkins, right?
No, they called her Miss Perkins because, yes, her husband was mentally ill and was institutionalized, and it was so stigmatized at the time that everyone thought it would be better to just refer to her as Miss Perkins and never mention him, rather than to bring up his existence. And no, she had a daughter as well, but she was charting, uncharted territory by becoming the first woman cabinet member. One of the first questions she got when she got to Washington is, what are we going to call you? We call everyone else Mr. Secretary. And then came Madam Secretary. But she was really inventing a new rule book.
Eleanor Roosevelt was not very influential in the first 90 days, was she?
Yeah, she was in the background. She had not yet really found her own voice. And no, it really was Frances Perkins. And, in that wonderful oral history that Frances...
They didn't have a great...
Yeah, Frances Perkins talks about how it bothered her that everyone assumed that they were great friends, and she must have gotten her job because of Eleanor. And she said that we weren't. She got her job, thank you very much, because of all the great work she had done and her accomplishments and her education and so forth. And she thought of Eleanor as being different from her. Eleanor had gotten where she gotten by who she married, and she had a certain role as First Lady. Frances Perkins was all about the work. She had the master's degree. She worked her way up the labor movement. She was a factory inspector. She got there by, sheer competence. And she wasn't so comfortable with the comparison.
Right. The labor movement, the office that she took over was really a patronage haven for the unions, right?
Absolutely, yes.
Did the unions wholeheartedly support Roosevelt?
They loved Roosevelt, and he loved them, and they were a big part of his coalition. They were a little less in love with Frances Perkins, in part because she wasn't quite a union person. She believed in having fair labor laws, and she said, if you have a union contract, it protects everyone in the union. If you have the Fair Labor Standards Act with the minimum wage, that protects every worker. So in a way, she was even, I think, greater than the labor movement, because she understood, she liked them, she thought they were doing important things, but she really believed her constituency was every worker.
So what are you doing now?
So I am
You're writing
working.
another
well,
book.
I just finished a book.
Let me just interrupt you. People should read this because it's not dry at all.
Oh, thank you.
It's so interesting.
Thank you.
And it is interesting today. Go on.
Thank you. So I just finished a book, it came out last year, called Imbeciles, the Supreme Court, American Eugenics and the Sterilization of Carrie Buck, about one of the worst cases in Supreme Court history where they upheld eugenic sterilization. The states, more than half the states had laws to sterilize people who were unemployed, alcoholic, lazy, all these categories to try to uplift the race. And yeah, 8-1, the Supreme Court, Oliver Wendell Holmes upholds this shocking decision, which says a lot about, how much the Supreme Court has gotten wrong in history. And now I'm working on something that's more directly related to current times.
When was that?
That was 1927, which was actually a big era for eugenics. And what's shocking is how much progressives got it wrong. Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote the decision, but Louis Brandeis, the great progressive on the court, voted with the majority. And some of our progressive heroes, people like Margaret Sanger and others, were eugenicists. It was a really crazy time and not enough understood today, kind of forgotten.
We'll have to talk about it, go back and talk about it with its relationship to abortion.
Abortion, absolutely. And also, we're beginning to hear a little bit of, some talk on the far right about eugenics again.
Yeah.
So I think it's worth keeping in mind.
So thank you very much, Adam Cohen.
Oh,
and people should read this book. Look for your new book and read that. You're a great writer.
Thank you so much, Ronnie. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. We at CUNY TV always like to hear from our viewers. So if you have any subjects you'd like to explore or people you'd like to hear, please let us know. Write to us at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or go to our website, cuny.tv, and click on Contact Us. We look forward to hearing from you.